The Panzerfaust was an inexpensive, single-shot German anti-tank weapon. When used against tanks, the Panzerfaust had an impressive beyond-armor effect. Compared to the Panzerschreck, it made a larger hole and produced massive spalling that killed or injured the tank crew. In 1944, during the Battle of Normandy, only 5% of Allied tank losses were from Panzerfaust fire. However, the threat from the Panzerfaust forced Allied tank forces to wait for infantry support before advancing. In urban combat later in the war in eastern Germany, about 70% of tanks destroyed were hit by this weapon. So the Soviet and Western Allied tank crews started to modify their tanks in the field so as to provide some kind of protection against the Panzerfaust attacks. These included logs, sandbags, track links, concrete and wire mesh. During the last stages of the war, due to the lack of available weapons, many poorly trained conscripts, mainly elderly men and teenagers, were often given a single Panzerfaust plus any type of obsolete pistols or rifles. Some only had a Panzerfaust and nothing else. This caused several German generals and even officers to comment sarcastically that the empty launch tubes could then be used as clubs in hand-to-hand combat. During the Battle of Berlin in 1945, several T-34 85 tanks had bed springs on the turret and hull sides used as a spaced armor to defeat the Panzerfaust. These were both factory-produced and improvised in the field. While fighting in Berlin, on orders from the commander of Soviet armored and mechanized forces, units installed meshes over tank turrets and driver compartments. Metal meshes with bars of 1 mm were used for this purpose, forming 4 cm by 4 cm squares. These meshes were welded 200 mm away from the armor, with the intention that the focus of the blast was aimed outside of the armor. In fact, these meshes were actually useless. The Panzerfaust still broke the fence and side plate. In practice, about 1 meter of air gap was required to reduce the penetrating capability of the warhead. Thus, side skirts and sandbags, along with other improvised armor, were virtually entirely ineffective against the Panzerfaust. Moreover, the added weight from such add-on armor overburdened the vehicle's engine, transmission, and suspension systems. It was only useful against the weaker Panzerfaust 30, which wasn't the most used type of weapon in 1945. However, the crews still decided to use the spaced armor to improve their chances of survival. So these meshes basically acted as a kind of morale boost for the Soviet tank crews. After the war, the Soviet Union continued research to find the most effective protection for their tanks and tank crews. The idea of counter-explosion in armor was first proposed in 1949 by academician Bogdan Vyacheslav Wojciechowski, an outstanding scientist in mechanics and physics who was the author of more than 200 scientific works, 2 discoveries, and more than 100 inventions. The counter-explosion must disrupt the incoming projectile so that its momentum is distributed in all directions rather than towards the target, greatly diminishing its effectiveness. An element of explosive reactive armor is made out of a sheet of high explosive sandwiched between two plates, typically metal, called the reactive elements. The first pre-production models were produced during the 1960s. However, insufficient theoretical analysis during one of the tests resulted in all of the prototype elements being blown up. For a number of reasons, including this accident, as well as the belief that Soviet tanks had sufficient armor, the research was ended in the late 1960s. No more research was conducted until 1974, when the Ministry of Defense announced a contest to find the best tank protection project. It is interesting to note that a West German researcher, Manfred Held, carried out similar work with the Israel Defense Forces in 1969. Reactive armor created on the basis of this joint German-Israeli research. It was first installed on Israeli tanks during the 1982 Lebanon War and was judged very effective. Explosive reactive armor has been valued by the Soviet Union since the 1980s, and almost every tank in the Eastern European military inventory today has been manufactured to use reactive armor tiles added to it, including the T-34 and T-62 tanks built 40 and 50 years ago but still used by the reserve units.